Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's IFG webinar. Today, we're going to be examining yesterday's statement from Rachel Reeves, trying to make sense of all the facts and figures that she set out on the state of the public finances. I think the message that the Chancellor was obviously trying to get across was pretty clear. Things are bad. The last Conservative government has left the new Labour government a terrible inheritance. And she's going to need to make some tough choices to balance the book. So today we're going to ask, how bad are things really? We're going to say, is Rachel Reeves' blame game really fair? We're going to assess the choices she's made and the ones she may have to make in the future. Joining me throughout today are IFG Chief Economist Gemma Tetlow, Nick Davies, who leads our work on public services, and our senior economist, Olly Bartrum. Please do send in your questions if you have any. If you like questions which have been submitted already via Slido on your screen, then please uprate them so I can see which the most popular ones are, so I know which ones to put to the team. And we'll do our best to answer those questions over the course of the next hour. So let's kick off, Gemma, with you. What was this statement trying to do, and how unusual would you say it was?
There were sort of three bits to Rachel Reeves's statement. So the first bit was setting out what she described as being spending pressures that they didn't know about before they came into office and that the Treasury have revealed to them. And that's spending commitments for this financial year and next financial year that weren't reflected, Reeves said, in the headline spending plans for departments that the previous government had set out. The second bit was a set of policies that were going to be cut, or other areas of cuts to make within government spending, to try and help offset some of these unexpected spending pressures. And then the third bit of the statement was setting out some changes to what you might call the fiscal framework, so the way in which policy is made within government, that hopefully will try and avoid a future situation where we end up with a similar set of problems in terms of what we know about public spending and what the plans are. So we had been talking before the election, and others had, about the pressures on public spending and the fact that we said that the previous government spending plans, which Labour had signed up to in opposition, weren't plausible, that they simply didn't match up to the spending pressures that the government was facing. What we saw yesterday was a little bit different, in the sense that these were spending pressures coming this year and next year, rather than the sort of longer term pressures that we had mainly been focusing on, thinking about evolving over the Parliament.
Would you say...
Sorry, you had a second bit to the question. Was it unusual? I think you said.
Unusual, yes, exactly.
So in a sense, I think what we saw spelt out was things that, some of which go on every year within government, we just don't see it. So, for example, extra costs from support for Ukraine was something that Rachel Reeves talked about. The government does set aside a reserve every year to meet unexpected spending pressures, and some of what Reeves said they would do is to allocate the 9 billion of reserve to those costs. Some of what she was talking about higher pay settlements for government departments, for public sector workers rather, than had been budgeted for by the Treasury. We have had that happen before. So last year, the government decided to give higher pay settlements to public sector workers than had been budgeted for in the previous spending review. And so last year, some of that was said to come from existing budgets. We just didn't see the government spell out exactly how departments had shuffled around their spending allocations to meet those costs. And some came from extra money being allocated last year, but crucially not enough into this year to cover those ongoing costs. So I think some of it is sort of shining more of a public light on things that government does every year anyway. It just doesn't tend to put it in the public domain. Some of it, I think, are bigger costs than would normally materialise. And so is it kind of genuinely bigger pressure that was difficult for the new government to deal with, without either just borrowing more to cover those costs or trying to make some offsetting savings?
I think my laptop camera appears to have given up. You may have to do without seeing me on this webinar, but never mind. It's an undisclosed additional cost the IFG is going to have to make in buying me a new laptop. Gemma, one of the things that we've said was really that, and actually, well, to quote, things the party opposite covered up from the opposition, covered up from this house, covered up from the country. What was she talking about? What, in those terms, as you say, before the election, we had been saying lots of this was visible, or was this really about politics?
So I think some of this, there were clearly decisions that the previous government chose not to make a decision on before the election, to sort of punt it to the new government. Things like the pay settlements for the public sector. Those could have been announced before the election. They had asked the peer review bodies to send them their recommendations by May, but those decisions weren't made, and so the new government has had to pick that up. So that's something where I think it was clear that the budgeted for 2% pay rises were probably not going to be consistent with recruiting, retaining, motivating public sector staff, given where private sector wages are at the moment. But there wasn't a firm figure on that. So that isn't a decision that the new government has made, and so wasn't a number that the previous government would concretely have known, although we would all have known that the number was going to be bigger than had been budgeted for. Some of the other things, I think perhaps some of the ones that were least visible to the outside were things like the extra costs for asylum and immigration, which were not in the Home Office's budgeted plans, but are a clear result of the previous government's policies around their Rwanda plan, that they had stopped processing asylum claims, but they hadn't managed to get people on planes to Rwanda. And so there were a growing number of people who couldn't be processed, couldn't be shifted out of the country when those claims failed. And so more people sitting in hotels needing accommodation, that was a direct result of the previous government's policy decisions, was known about within government, but wasn't reflected in the headline numbers, and something we couldn't see from the outside.
So, Nick, it was justifiable then for Reeves to be surprised about some of this?
I think it probably was justified. I think some of those externally who said that there wasn't really going to be anything to be surprised about have now said afterwards that actually there were a few surprising things in there. And it is, I think, notable that the OBR is now conducting a review of the information that it was provided in the run-up to the March budget and its last estimate. So, we'll hopefully find out the true story in October when that reports, but it does seem that there was some surprising elements there.
And as Gemma said, some of the decisions that Rachel Reeves has made, the difficult decisions, but she didn't have to make all of them.
So I think the big one that was flagged by Hunt and by the Conservatives were the higher pay settlements, which in theory were a choice. So the pay review bodies make a recommendation, but the ultimate decision rests with government. However, politically, I don't think Rachel Reeves and Labour really did have much of a choice. As Gemma said, even the Sunak government, which took a fairly kind of aggressive approach to pay negotiations, felt obliged to accept the recommendations of the pay review bodies, even when they came in higher than expected. And given the pretty substantial recruitment and retention challenges right across public services, it would have had a pretty major impact not to have accepted those. And clearly over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've had some of the most disruptive and most widespread public sector strikes that we've had in a generation. And I think if Labour had not accepted those pay review body recommendations, further widespread strikes would have been on the way. And it's not to say that even though have accepted them, that there won't be any strikes, but they would have been much more significant if they hadn't.
Thanks, Nick. Olly, Reeves also set out, as Gemma said at the end, her plans for future spending reviews. We welcome much of what she said, don't we?
Yeah, we do indeed. So I think some of the main things that I'd pick out from what she said are, first, the sort of sequencing of fiscal events over the course of the next sort of 9 months, where she said she's going to have a budget on the 30th of October, which we can come back to later. But Crucially, there will be some spending plans announced at that budget. So we'll have a sort of combined budget spending round sort of thing. But that will only sort of restate this year's budgets, so the current financial year, and how things have moved around as a consequence of decisions taken today and potentially more decisions on in-year spending taken at the budget. And then she will do a sort of full multi-year spending review settlement in March, not in March, sorry, in the spring, so possibly in March, but who knows. We put a report out in March saying that this is the approach that the government should take because they shouldn't rush to settle all departments' budgets on a multi-year basis over the next couple of months. So we're really happy that they're taking this staggered approach. We think it will allow them to sort of really build the evidence base for the decisions that they take for the multi-year spending review and to really develop their sort of missions and other priorities into a set of outcomes that they want to target through the spending review. And another thing that we're really enthusiastic about, I don't know why it's not on the front pages, but she's going to set out the spending review process in the Charter for Budget Responsibility. Why is that important? We've never really had this sort of process set out formally anywhere. It's sort of done in quite an ad hoc way. So people sort of outside of the Treasury will sort of have an idea of when a spending review might be and what the process might look like, but it was always done in quite an ad hoc way. It might come as a bit of a surprise. The departments find it difficult to plan. They don't really know what type of process they're inputting into. So to have that set out in the Charter is a really helpful addition. So what the Charter is going to include is it's going to sort of set out how long spending reviews should budget for and how frequently they should be conducted. Where the key change is that spending reviews will always set budgets for a minimum of 3 years and they'll be done every 2 years. So they're always done on a rolling basis. Two really big benefits of that. One, we always have a bit of multi-year certainty over budgets. And another one is because they're rolling, we don't have the problem that we have this year of sort of a cliff edge. We're only a couple of months away from current spending review plans ending. So that's all really welcome. We think she could have gone a bit further, set out 5-year budgets. We think that really maximizes the benefits of certainty to departments. And there's lots and lots of other ways in which we think the spending review process could be improved, all coming in a report on Thursday. So we hope what was said yesterday can be built on as Rachel Reeves thinks about how to run that multi-year spending review.
Must read report. Olly, one of the questions we've had in on Slido, our currently highest rated question, is about the Office for Value for Money and how it will operate alongside the work of organisations such as the government commercial function. Is that something we know much about yet?
So we don't really know much at all about the Office for Value for Money. We know that it's going to be an internal Treasury team that's sort of set up to spot and stop sort of poor value for money spending. But it's not really clear how they're going to go about that, how they're sort of integrated into decision-making processes. So we don't know whether they're going to be involved in, reviewing bids into budgets or spending review processes to stop ideas, before they've even started, or maybe it's when a project's just started and they're sort of getting involved after it's got the go-ahead at a budget or spending review. I think the most important, or at least for me, the most significant thing about it is that it's an internal Treasury team. We, in our report on Thursday, argue that spending should be subject to much greater sort of scrutiny, both before it's decided and while it's being spent, not just the sort of ex post scrutiny that the NAO provides. It sort of in the way that the OBR provides, ex ante scrutiny of tax and welfare policies. So, the evidence will go to the OBR, who will scrutinise it and sort of give it a tick and incorporate it into the forecast. So we think that there could be a role for that sort of function to scrutinise spending a bit more. And we saw both the Office for Value for Money announcement, which might do this sort of thing, but will be limited by the fact that it's an internal Treasury team. And then another thing which might come back to you later is that OBR was given sort of additional powers to scrutinise the spending forecast that the Treasury makes. My reading of the short amount of text is that this is not the same sort of scrutiny that the OBR applies to tax and welfare. It's much more limited, but it's a step in the right direction.
Thanks, Olly, and thanks to our wonderful head of events, Lauren, who's brought me a new computer with a working camera. You mentioned there, Olly, the budget. What are our, and we've had some questions about this as well. What are our expectations about what will come next in the budget, which will be in October, won't it?
Sure. Yeah, it's going to be October 30th, I think, very narrowly avoiding Halloween. I think we had a recent one on Halloween that generated all sorts of unfortunate headlines. So in terms of what we should expect there, we will see the sort of what we usually see at budgets, which is a updated forecast from the OBR, which will be very interesting because we will see how they approach the sort of the economic growth impact scoring of government policies. So their judgment on economic growth, A, reflecting, like I just said, the impact of economic policies, but B, other developments in the economy will be really interesting because, as we've heard Rachel Reeves say sort of countless times, she sees economic growth as the solution to some of the very big fiscal problems she faces. So we're certainly all looking forward to seeing what the OBR comes up with there. We'll see, as is usual with budgets, some policy announcements, particularly on tax and welfare. There's certainly been lots of speculation about what exactly we might see on tax at the October budget. The Chancellor sort of repeated her commitment to not raise the rates of income tax, national insurance, or VAT. Perhaps we can get into what's left. But the other things are, like I said earlier, we will see detailed departmental spending plans. So we'll have a sort of mini spending round. We'll see what money departments have to play with next year. And most excitingly, we will get the updated Charter for Budget Responsibility, setting out the detail on all the process reforms that hinted at earlier. And of course, a new set of fiscal rules, where it'll be interesting to see if the Chancellor decides to game them a little bit. And, I think potentially our 9th set since 2009, 2010. So yeah, those are the main things I'm looking out for in October.
Right. Thanks, Olly. Nick, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I think the main thing I'll be looking for are the many more unpalatable decisions that Rachel Reeves is going to have to make in October. As was mentioned earlier, yesterday's statement was focused on the additional cost pressures in this financial year, in 2024-2025. However, the pressures from April 25 onwards are much higher. And the budgets are much tighter. So the numbers that were penciled in by the last government and which Labour kind of broadly signed up to, if you take those and then make some assumptions about some of the spending commitments made in the Labour manifesto, they imply a just over 1% overall increase in spending in the coming 3-year spending review period. But once you take into account the money needed to deliver the NHS long-term workforce plan and commitments on aid and defence and childcare, and if you assume that school spending will stay flat in per pupil terms, for what's left, what we would call unprotected spending, that would see cuts of 2.4% per year on average in each of the 3 years of that spending review. And that would include services, but like particularly in public services, criminal justice services like the police, criminal courts, and prisons, which are already in a terrible state and unable to deal with the demand they are facing. And it's simply not credible that any government, whoever had won the election, would be able to implement cuts that deep. And the reason those cuts that deep were penciled in was not because Jeremy Hunt had any intention of delivering them, it was because it enabled him to meet his fiscal rules. So it would be, something is going to have to give. And I think, as Rachel Reeves implied yesterday, there are going to be tax rises coming, though not on national insurance, income tax or VAT, but there are definitely going to be tax rises coming elsewhere. There'll probably be some additional borrowing, and there will probably be some cuts to some services as well. But the current numbers are not sustainable, so something is going to have to give. And the difficult decisions she made yesterday are nothing on what she's going to have to announce at the end of October.
Thanks, Nick. Gemma, I want to come to you, but just before I do, I've got a technical question which is coming from an anonymous listener. In terms of the cuts, you talked there about protected departments. Is it necessarily the case that the same departments will now be protected? And what do you think the implications are in the next spending review for local government?
So they're not really protected. They're sort of protected by promises that have been made, but promises can be broken. And so clearly there are the sort of set promises on a kind of percentage of GDP that will be spent on defence and on aid. We have to make it, Labour had committed to delivering the NHS long-term workforce plan, but, that is a huge amount of money. That's 3.6% real terms increases in every year. So we just we basically have to make assumptions based on existing promises about what is protected and what isn't. But I think, as the questioner implies, I think everything will be up for discussion in the Treasury right now and with departments. So exactly how that plays out is to be seen.
Gemma.
Just to add to what Nick said there on the implications of the next spending review for local government, I think one thing that was welcome for local government from Reeves' statement yesterday was that she said they would be making multi-year spending settlements for local government rather than what we've had in the past, where they've had just 1-year budgets, which makes it incredibly hard for them to make sensible long-term spending decisions. I think that will be really welcome for local government, even if they don't get any more money overall. The other area that the new government are clearly going in is doing more devolution of responsibilities and making greater use of sort of single larger spending pots being handed down to subnational government to allow them a bit more flexibility about how they spend those budgets. So I think it could be a period of really quite significant change for subnational government in how their budgets are set and how much freedom they have. But the other thing I was going to pick up on, just on Olly's mention of welfare spending policies, it was another thing I think was interesting in Reeves's statement yesterday was she talked about the fact they wanted to look at the welfare system alongside other public spending in the multi-year spending review. And this is something that Olly's report later this week emphasises the importance of as well, because in recent spending reviews, we've really just had the government looking at departmental settlements, public service spending. But obviously there are big interactions between what we do with welfare policy and spending on public services. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how the government approaches that and whether we get announcements on specific welfare policy changes in the autumn, or do they delay doing some of that thinking to allow them to look comprehensively at welfare alongside public service spending, and then make some of those further announcements in the spring multi-year settlements?
Just to give a quick example of that, one of the big early totemic decisions they're going to have to make is on what to do to the two-child limit. And that's a substantial amount of money. It's a few £billions, but in terms of the interactions that Gemma just mentioned with public services, there's a lot of very good evidence that poverty is a key driver of demand for acute services. And given that Rachel Reeves emphasised that they want to have a new approach to reforming public services with prevention at the heart of that, you could easily make the case that scrapping the two-child limit, which would raise hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty, would have a knock-on positive impact in reducing that demand for acute and expensive public services down the line. So I think those are some of the things they'll be weighing up and trading off over the coming months.
Nick, while I've got you, we've talked about some things we welcomed in this statement. Social care is something where we seem to not be making any progress, with social care is being sent off into a royal commission. Do we think this is sensible, or is it really just putting it back into the long grass?
I mean, I'm not even sure it's being sent off into a royal commission anymore. So this was what was being reported before the King's speech, that they were considering launching a royal commission on options for reforming social care. But then there was no bill of that nature in the King's speech, and everything has gone very quiet on it since. And in the statement yesterday, Rachel Reeves said she was not going to implement the cap next year. This was originally the proposal of the Dilnot Commission more than a decade ago. It was originally delayed by George Osborne as Chancellor. It was brought back, but then Jeremy Hunt more recently delayed it. So I don't think it's not clear what, if anything, is going to happen on that. Potentially an interesting bit of news today. So they announced who was going to chair all of the relevant select committees, and the Lib Dem, someone from the Lib Dems will be chairing the Health and Social Care Committee. And given that social care was right at the heart of the Lib Dem campaign in the election, I think we can expect, and they had already suggested some sort of cross-party commission, I think we can expect the government to be getting kind of a lot of pressure from the Health and Social Care Committee on that front. But whether they do go with a Royal Commission, TBC. If they are going to have a commission of some sort, we would not recommend a Royal Commission. The recent history of them is extremely poor. The most recent ones on social care and Lords reform weren't implemented. The social care one was partially implemented in Scotland, but otherwise they were not successful. They also take a very long time and are generally fairly expensive. And for this issue, where we broadly know what the problems are and what the solutions are, it doesn't seem that there's much use in a sort of fact-finding idea generation process. The issue is either the government, because it's got a whacking great majority, could just get it done, or if you really want to build some cross-party support to give yourself political cover, potentially for revenue-raising measures needed to pay for it, we would suggest that the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards would be a much better model for that. So that was led by the then chair of the Treasury Committee. It used the resources of the Treasury Committee in their staff, were kind of the basis of the Secretariat for it. They seconded in a lot of other experts, but because it was made up of kind of very high profile and respected members of both the Commons and Lords, there was then kind of a natural group of respected advocates for the proposals, and all of the recommendations from the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards were implemented. And because Andrew Tyree, the chair of the Treasury Committee, was in that post, he was able to kind of hold the government to account after it published its findings to make sure it was implemented. So if they are going to go down the commission route, which I don't really think they need to, but if they are, then that would be a much better model.
Gemma, you want to come in?
I was just going to come in. I mean, Nick talked there about the need for cross-party consensus to help the government have cover for introducing reforms. I think there's an important other aspect of needing cross-party support for social care reform, which is that this is actually a really long-term policy issue where the challenge that people face is planning for your financial future is really hard when you don't know if you're going to be one of the unlucky few who face enormously high social care costs. And so a lot of the reforms that are being talked about are really trying to ensure people against those incredibly high long-term costs. But for any reform to really make a difference to people and how they plan, they need to be confident that that policy is going to remain in place for a long time and not be reversed by a future government. So I think that's another reason to want cross-party support. And I think that would also be what's needed for example, the private insurance market to develop for covering long-term care costs, which at the moment, that private market doesn't really work because those tail risks are so enormous.
Really interesting. And as you say, Nick, we've found out which party you're going to chair, which select committee. We now are going to see which members put themselves forward for those roles. And I think that will be really interesting. We see how the opposition parties, having chosen which of the most important committees to them, to try to get the chairs of who then stands for those positions. Although, of course, given their whole House elections for select committee chairs, it's really the view of the Labour Party on who should chair which committee is going to be quite important, I think. Gemma, I just wanted to go back to something that Nick mentioned earlier on, which was this point that the OBR has said it has concerns about the transparency and credibility of the Conservative government's forecasting and spending plans. And we've had a question from another anonymous listener saying, how is it possible that there were these pressures, but they were, and proposals were announced, but funding wasn't put in place for them? How unusual is this, and how significant the fact that the OBR have said they're going to do this, and how much of a headache could that be for civil servants?
I think it's very interesting. So in the OBR historically, for future years, really has to just take the government's stated departmental spending plans as given. And the only real adjustment the OBR has made to those is to assume some sort of deviation against the stated total. And that's actually tended in the past to be an assumption that they will slightly underspend their budgets, because the spending management processes within UK government are such that there is a strong incentive not to overspend your budget if you're a departmental permanent secretary. And so they're very good at kind of coming in a bit under budgets. And so that's what the OBR has assumed in the past. But they haven't, I guess they've had limited ability in the past to really dig under that. Although actually, even when, a few times when we've spoken to the OBR about this and asked, well, but we know there are pressures on budgets, don't you think there might be a risk? Perhaps do you want to kind of present a scenario where there's a risk of overspending? And often the response has always been that it's true, but actually the record of the past is that actually government is very good at making sure that we don't overspend, and the risk is always to the quality of services delivered. Basically, the government will find savings somewhere to make sure they come in on budget, even if that means slightly worse outcomes in some areas than would otherwise have been the case. So I think it's really interesting that they're going to look back at the March forecasts and kind of look at, presumably, what questions did they ask the Treasury at that time? What responses did they get to those questions? Were they given any misleading information? But I think it's going to be really crucial what they end up concluding there, because, as Olly said, the OBR does have a role already in sort of challenging and scrutinising forecasts for tax and welfare spending. And they're now going to have a new responsibility for sort of doing more to scrutinise in year and 1 year ahead departmental expenditure limit totals. But I think it's going to be much harder for them to do that. It seems to me they will be much more reliant on whatever it is that the Treasury government chooses to give them, because there are, I think, fewer sources of sort of independent insight that they might draw on to challenge whatever it is that the Treasury are telling them. And so I think it'll be really we really need to see what the OBR conclude from the March experience and what they therefore recommend about what they're going to need to see from the government to understand whether actually will this be meaningful scrutiny, or will the OBR actually be very hard pushed to really challenge the Treasury's numbers if in the future ministers decided that actually they were not so keen on being open and transparent about in-year spending pressures. So I think that's really what I'm going to be looking for from that OBR assessment.
Yeah, and it's going to be quite an unattractive prospect, isn't it, for a senior Treasury civil servant to be providing information to the OBR, which might be uncomfortable for the government. So presumably the OBR won't know what it doesn't know.
Exactly, and I suppose it's hard to see what's the circumstance in which ministers and the Treasury are publicly saying our expectation is that the budgets will be X, and then the OBR, in light of information given to them by the Treasury, come to an independent decision that actually it's not X, it's X plus some number. That's quite a kind of, yeah, I'm not quite sure how that will work and what information the OBR will be really able to draw on to properly challenge the Treasury on that.
Olly.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Gemma just said. There's one small additional point, which I'll keep quite short because it's very deeply in the weeds. But another thing that the Rachel Reeves committed to yesterday was to greater transparency and more information sharing between the Treasury and the OBR. Obviously motivated by this review that the OBR has launched into the process. Obviously, they feel as though there wasn't quite a sort of frank information exchange going on there. And we have, you know, in public statements seen this issue a couple of times. So I think the OBR has previously complained that it couldn't speak to people in the DFE about the impact of a particular policy and could only speak to the Treasury. And, you know, when we've sort of privately spoken to people involved in the forecasting process for various projects over the years, it is clear that this information exchange, which when you read the agreement between the Treasury and OBR should be completely and entirely open, is not really. So it'll be interesting to see how they sort of change the relationship between the two institutions to guarantee that, and to sort of, I guess, work against that incentive that you described that Treasury officials will face to sort of keep uncomfortable information close to their chest.
It'll be interesting. I have to see how that plays out. Nick, while we're talking about civil servants, departments are being told they're going to have to absorb about a third of the cost of the public sector pay rises, which the government's decided to commit to. So that adds up to about 3.2 billion. How feasible does that feel to you?
It's feasible, but that doesn't mean it won't be painful. So the biggest bit of that is like they're hoping to save just over £500 million in this year from ending or by spending less on consultancy services. It's quite actually difficult to measure exactly how much we spend on consultancy services because it depends how you define it, and the data's not great. We probably spend somewhere between 6 and 8 billion across government on consultancy services. More broadly, central government is the vast majority of that, and most of that is management consultancy, which I think is probably what they are referring to. In terms of their ability to do that, I think one thing that will make it substantially easier is Rachel Reeves also announced that they are going to be removing the headcount cap on the civil service. And one of the main reasons why consultants are used is to provide extra capacity that is not available there from the kind of full-time civil service workforce. So you may be able to spend 550 million less on consultancy services. Whether you actually end up saving any more money or whether you end up spending that instead on civil servants is to be confirmed. There was also a 2% saving on a kind of back office. Exactly what that is, slightly unclear. The only thing that makes me a bit wary on that is it's kind of, for a long time, been a kind of favourite go-to for ministers to say, we're going to support the front line and we're going to crack down on those kind of useless back office managers and admin staff. But, you know, in some services, particularly in the NHS, you know, our own research and that of others suggests that, you know, the NHS is really badly undermanaged, and it's really difficult to kind of effectively and efficiently allocate your resources if you don't have enough management capacity to do that. So it's unclear where they'll make those cuts, but I would worry about where they will come from.
Olly, while we're talking about capacity of the civil service, we've got a question come in. It says, just thinking about your experience previously in the civil service, is an autumn budget, multi-year spending review and all sorts of reviews or capital spending in between going to stretch the civil service, and is the timeline realistic from a capacity standpoint? As you say, the government has largely followed the schedule that we thought was a sensible plan in terms of spending review, but is the civil service going to be able to deliver?
Look, it's going to be tough, and it's going to be a busy year. But I guess I would just point to the spending reviews that we've run in the past, where we ran fairly big, substantial spending reviews in 2010 and 2015 that were conducted over a space of 4 months. Now, you can certainly criticize the outcomes of those spending reviews for perhaps not achieving the best outcomes, but we did run big multi-year spending reviews in that amount of time. So, you know, a spring deadline at least doubles the time available to the Treasury and other departments to bring all of that together, which is exactly the reason why we suggested that they should space it out, so that you don't compress all of the evidence generation, bid writing, scrutiny, and negotiations that are essentially going to define your next 5 or well, now 3 under Rachel Reeves' announcement years in government into such a short time frame. Of course, the other thing that we have long been advocates of, that is at least going to help timing wise, is a commitment to a single fiscal event a year. I think single fiscal event means single budget or autumn statement, and spending review is like a sort of separate, like, allocated thing that happens, which is why they're allowed to do 2, but commit to 1. But we've long argued that doing that will free up loads of time in the Treasury, but also elsewhere, to do things that aren't generating small policies to go into the next budget. So, you know, working with departments on thinking about what their strategy is in the long term and how they're gonna deal with sort of bigger problems, rather than just a sort of bauble generation machine, which it can turn into, because budget preparation, if you have a budget and an autumn statement, will take up at least 6 months of the year, and probably a lot more. So that's a welcome move. I mean, but yeah, it's going to be very busy. There's a lot of decision making compressed into a relatively short space of time, but very happy that they've announced a staggered review. And to be fair, if it ends up being a lot of work, particularly if, another plug for the report on Thursday, they do the sort of targeted policy reviews ahead of the spending review that we advocate for, it wouldn't be the end of the world if spring turns into summer, as long as departments get, you know, a good amount of notice ahead of the financial year in which their settlement begins.
Gemma, I want to put a question to you that's come in from Philip Rutland, former Permanent Secretary, of course, and it comes back to this question that we've been talking about in relation to the thinking the OBR is now doing. He asks, could you reflect on the respective roles of officials and ministers for in-year financial control? If commitments in 2004-5 exceeded the resources available, shouldn't there have been some requests before the election for directions by accounting officers?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. It's obviously the kind of challenge that Jeremy Hunt put to Rachel Reeves in Parliament, saying, well, you've just published a load of estimates for the year that was supposed to be the best estimate of departments' budgets. I think it's one area that highlights the difficult challenge between balancing the role of permanent secretaries and the role of ministers in departments, and how far permanent secretaries at what point do they go public with a disagreement with their minister about what actually represents value for money. I mean, managing public money guidance says that permanent secretaries should ask for a ministerial direction where they think a decision around public spending is not value for money, or may not represent value for money. In the past, we've only seen this done where a minister has decided they want to spend money on something, and then the permanent secretary has said, I'm not sure this represents value for money, and has asked for a ministerial direction to do it anyway. This is almost the opposite case of questions about decisions not to spend money, perhaps on known pressures. It's something we actually picked up in a report we put out just before the election on capital spending on public services, which was one area where we felt there were decisions that had been made in the past, for example, not to maintain hospital buildings and the like, where we felt that there was essentially a decision that was made not to spend some money that resulted in longer term worse value for the public purse. Currently within managing public money guidance, it is possible for permanent secretaries to ask for ministerial directions on that basis, as in, can you confirm that your decision not to spend on this is the one you want to make, and even though that may not be good value for taxpayer money in the longer term. But that hasn't happened in the past, and I guess the question here is whether any of the permanent secretaries ought to have been asking for more of that. For example, did a decision not to allocate enough money to housing asylum seekers, for example, represent poor value for money, or could those decisions reasonably have been delayed? I think it's a genuinely interesting question. I mean, I think the other thing that Jeremy Hunt picked up on was his statement that Rachel Reeves could have asked Treasury officials all these questions before the election in access talks and could have been given the answers, where I think that's much more of a stretch to think that Jeremy Hunt would actually have been happy for his officials to be giving this kind of information to Rachel Reeves before the election had even taken place.
Thanks, Gemma. Nico, you've done work for us on the past on infrastructure, and we have a question from David Milliken, who asks, how big is the risk to projects such as HS2 between Euston and Old Oak Common and other big road and rail infrastructure projects? And is it a problem for our budget rules if they disincentivize this sort of spending? Another thing we have thought about in the RTG.
Well, given some of the pre-briefing ahead of yesterday's statement, I think we were probably expecting more cuts to infrastructure than were actually announced. In the end, it was only a couple of road projects and I think one other project. So it was not that much, but clearly that is a risk in October. I think in public services, but also economic infrastructure, as a country, we have tended to underinvest versus other countries. And that makes short-term sense if you are a minister and you are facing kind of substantial, for example, acute public service pressures. The things that you are going to be getting a lot of heat on in your inbox are going to be the fact that ambulances are stuck outside hospitals and that type of thing, not that you haven't done enough to support long-term economic growth in the country. But obviously, ultimately, all of these public service costs need to be paid for, and it's much easier to pay for them if the economy is growing robustly. And I think that is one of the questions that Rachel Reeves will be considering in the run-up to October, is given that she has said that their number one mission is to go for growth, to what extent is that reflected in decisions on investing in infrastructure?
Gemma.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, as Nick said, in the run-up to yesterday's statement, there was a lot of talk about the fact that Rachel Reeves is going to cancel a load of capital projects to help pay for these in-year spending pressures. And that sounded very odd. I mean, that sort of setup would have looked like very poor decision-making, as in, to cover sometimes one-off short-term day-to-day pressures, cancelling permanent capital spending projects would have looked like a very odd decision for all the reasons that Nick laid out. So I think we have to kind of think about how to interpret the announcements that were made on capital spending. And in the end, there were actually a very limited number of projects that were definitively cancelled. There was a bigger announcement about a review within the Department for Transport of a wider set of projects. I mean, clearly Rachel Reeves didn't need to announce in-year spending cuts in order to avoid borrowing being a bit higher this year. I think capital markets could happily have absorbed a bit more government borrowing. So the cuts that were announced were, I think, something more about political framing and pitching. I think perhaps partly sort of ahead of a budget which may announce further tax rises, perhaps showing that the government is willing and able to identify some spending cuts as well. On the specific projects that were cancelled, it must be the case that those were already high up the government's list of things that they didn't think were projects that they favoured. Otherwise, there wasn't really a need to rush into those decisions now. They could have delayed it and looked more broadly across other projects. So I think that's more about the political positioning than really about the need to avoid any further borrowing.
Olly, you mentioned earlier on the sort of assumption that this statement was in many ways about potentially rolling the pitch for tax rises and difficult decisions when we get to the budget in the autumn. We've got lots of questions from people asking all of your views on what the most likely areas are for tax rises. A particular question from Jonathan Waxman: do you think that council tax is a likely area? But tell us, what's left when you take away the things which Rachel Reeves has ruled out, and what are you reading from the signals about what's likely?
So I'll have a go, but then you should absolutely go to Gemma because she thought about this a bit more than me. Like I said, Rachel Reeves sort of repeated the Labour manifesto commitments to not raise national insurance, VAT, and I think it's specifically the basic and higher rates of income tax, which does rule out a lot of the existing base. I think the things that I've been hearing that they may move on are inheritance tax and capital gains. So specifically bring capital gains sort of closer to rates of income tax. I'll stop speculating on tax and let Gemma fill in the gaps. But I think the other thing to watch out for is, we mentioned the charter earlier, that will probably contain a new set of fiscal rules. There are some things that the government could do to give itself a bit more room for manoeuvre on spending without raising tax. So it could switch to a different measure of debt. Is one example. It could do something more radical and, change the framework in a bit more of a dramatic way, either by completely changing the way in which we design our fiscal rules, or by explicitly allowing debt to rise, perhaps for certain types of investment. I think that's probably quite unlikely, given how much Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have emphasised their the importance of fiscal rules and how committed they are to sticking to them, but perhaps more marginal changes like changing the measure of debt would give them a bit more room for manoeuvre.
Gemma, tell us about tax.
So as Olly said, maybe I'm reading far too much, probably I'm reading far too much into this, but it did seem that the pledge on income tax in the manifesto was quite carefully worded, that it was not raising the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax, unlike the pledge on NICs and VAT, which simply said we will not raise national insurance or VAT. So maybe there's something they're thinking about on income tax that's not one of those three rates. I agree with Olly that there has been talk about changes you could make to inheritance tax and capital gains tax, particularly closing some of the loopholes in those taxes, or not loopholes, I mean, they're kind of deliberate reliefs, but things like we don't charge inheritance tax on agricultural property and family businesses. Some of those could raise you some money. On council tax, which the questioner asked about, I mean, it's definitely an incredibly poorly designed tax. It makes no sense to have a tax which is based on your property value in 1991, given the hugely differential growth in property prices that there has been across the UK since then. Now, you could reform council tax in a very sensible way to more accurately reflect current property prices, and rather than having the current banded system, you could move to something that had was much more of a proportional tax on land value. You could do that in a way that didn't raise any extra revenue, which would essentially be shifting the tax burden towards London and the southeast, which have more expensive properties, and away from other parts of the country. But you could, of course, do that kind of sensible structural reform and raise some extra money at the same time. Obviously, the other big area of property taxation that the Labour government are consulting on is what to do with business rates. Not clear exactly what that would do. Again, you could make that more related to the value of land that those business properties are on, and try to move away from sort of discouraging things like green efficiency improvements to buildings, which can at the moment increase your business rates liability. If you were to reform property tax, the other one you might want to think about at the same time is stamp duty land tax, which is an economically horrible tax because it discourages people from moving home. And it's one of the problems with our housing market at the moment, because you have a lot of older people sitting in very expensive, large properties, but they're discouraged from moving because of stamp duty. So you could do something much more radical in property tax, shifting much more towards a sort of annual land value tax and away from some of these transaction taxes. But not sure. They may need to do a bit of pitch rolling, I think, if they were wanting to do something very radical of that form.
Fascinating. Nick, I'm going to give you the final. Olly wants to come in, and then I'm going to give Nick the final question.
Great. I'm just going to come in very quickly with I missed an opportunity to get a final plug-in for the spending review report. We have an enormous number of tax reliefs, which are exemptions from taxes for specific groups of people. Often these should be treated exactly like government spending, because they're nothing really to do with the scope or effectiveness of the tax system, but are there to achieve some other economic or social objectives. So, think about R&D reliefs or that sort of thing. It's not to do with how effective tax is, it's just because we want more R&D. So as well as looking at welfare as part of the spending review, Rachel Reeves should review all tax expenditures and sort of end the Treasury's sort of reluctance to trade tax off with spending, because certainly in the case of expenditures that they are exactly the same thing, and of the ones that we've costed, which is not all of them, they add up to roughly the size of the Department of Health and Social Care's budget. So there's plenty in there.
Very good. I thought, Olly, you were going to give another plug for your fiscal rules paper, which is also excellent. Nick, I'm going to ask you final question. What do you think is the most politically risky thing that Rachel Reeves did yesterday? Has she set up any sort of political dividing lines which are going to be a feature of future debate?
I think the biggest revenue raiser is probably the one that's also got the most pushback, which was the limiting of the winter fuel payment to those who are in most need and those who are in receipt of pension credit, as Rachel Reeves sort of acknowledged yesterday, and as many charities have since come out and said, there are a lot of people who are eligible who don't currently apply and therefore would lose their receipt of it. Her argument would be that that was introduced before the triple lock on pensions was introduced and has made pensions worth substantially more in real terms. So pensioner poverty is much less of a problem than it once was when the winter fuel payment was first introduced. Though, as ever, given that elections are won by those who are able to appeal to voters, and given that old people are much more likely to vote than younger people, it is clearly a potential risk if the Conservatives are able to paint the Labour government as one that is not interested in the interests of retired people.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute point. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Many thanks to Gemma, Olly and Nick for all your excellent analysis. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and thank you for all sending in such excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them all. You may have heard that we're publishing a paper later this week about spending reviews, so do keep your eyes peeled for that. You can watch this webinar back if you enjoyed it, so you can recommend it to your friends. They can watch it back. So please do that. The IFG events are taking a well-earned summer break from this point, unless anything turns up in British politics that we feel we absolutely must do an event on, which is not unheard of. But our team will be working on our brilliant schedule of events, which will be taking to party conferences in the autumn. So again, please do look out on our website for details of those. If you'll be going to conference, we look forward to seeing you there. But otherwise, have a great afternoon, everyone.